Today on Ag News Daily.
We did get an announcement from EPA that will allow E15 to be sold throughout the summer months again this year, an emergency waiver, but it's sort of a Band-Aid fix. What we really need is a permanent legislative solution that takes care of this once and for all. We were very close to getting that legislation across the finish line in December, but at the last minute, congressional Republicans decided they wanted to advance what they call a skinny continuing resolution bill, so all of the extraneous pieces fell out of that legislation, including the E15 bill.
Welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show, and it is grilling season.
I'm ready for it. It's been warm. Been getting some grilling in, been getting some dancing in.
I got steaks in the freezer right here. We should get after it. We did see this weather that you're discussing across the Great Plains and the Midwest, giving us an early preview of summer this past week. Temperatures in some areas soared well into the 90s, challenging records across parts of the northern plains. Blustery winds and dry conditions also raised wildfire concerns. A fire weather watch has been in effect since Tuesday evening for eastern South Dakota and western Minnesota, where gusty winds and dry fields created that elevated fire risk. Earlier this week, a slow-moving upper-level low provided some rainfall in the southeast and much of the Midwest. Heading into the weekend, we have another system that is expected to move through, bringing scattered showers and thunderstorms to most of the region. As that system pushes through, it will likely leave behind a lingering front near the Ohio River, which could keep things active into Saturday. Those rainfall chances are on the board for much of the Midwest, with the northwest portion of the region needing it the most. But looking ahead into early parts of next week, another system is expected to roll in, bringing additional rain chances. This is always welcome news in areas that are running dry. I know most of the producers here in the central part of Iowa are in that category of hoping that shot of rain hits us early next week.
Yeah, I was talking to a farmer from North Dakota who was sharing some of those warm temperature sentiments, and growers up there were certainly excited by it. But regardless of weather this week, that did little to keep crop progress moving forward. According to the latest USDA crop progress report, 62% of the nation's crop is now planted well ahead of the typical 5-year average at 56% usually for this time of year. It's not just in the ground, though. 28% of the crop has also emerged, outpacing the 5-year average of 21%. Soybean planting is also moving quickly, with 48% of the crop in the ground. This is higher than the usual 37% seen at this stage. On the wheat front, the USDA reports that 56% of winter wheat is rated good to excellent, an improvement of 5 points from last week. Meanwhile, spring wheat is also ahead of schedule, with 66% planted and 27% emerged, both figures surpassing the normal average for this time of year. Tanner, are you guys wrapped up with planting yet?
Wrapped up with planting and replant to try to get ahead of that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. We've got a couple fields that are going to be right on the border of maybe a replant, so we'll see.
That's right. Well, we know ransomware is on the rise and is the same for agriculture. The food and agriculture sector is facing sharp rises in these ransomware attacks. A new report from the Food and Agricultural Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that's a mouthful, reveals that there were 84 ransomware incidents in the first quarter alone of 2025, more than double the number from the same period of time last year. The Food and Ag ISAC, is that how they shorten that out?
Acronym.
The Food and Ag ISAC gathers threat data through open source monitoring, dark web tracking, member contributions, and cooperation with other ISACs. The food and agriculture sector is particularly vulnerable due to legacy equipment, industrial control systems, and the reliance on tightly run supply chains. The surge was driven largely in attacks that happened during January and February, which accounted for over 75% of those reported cases. Ransomware now makes up more than half of all cyber attacks targeting this industry. Analysts do point out the fallout from the clop hack of CleoFile, the sharing software and ongoing campaigns by the Akira and Ransom Hub ransomware gangs. So a couple of targeted groups there starting to drop off, according to this article. The report also highlights outdated industrial control systems and poor threat visibility as key vulnerabilities going forward. Jonathan Bradley, the Director of Cyber Information Sharing at the Food and Ag ISAC, says those weaknesses leave the sector especially exposed for future attacks. So more to come, hopefully not, but assuming there will be in that topic.
Well, it's interesting, too. When I was in D.C. last week, we heard from the FBI's cybersecurity branch, and we talked a lot about some of these very topics. So it's a little scary when you get too much into the weeds. You have to maybe parse yourself away from it. But we had a momentous this week on the trade front as the U.S. and U.K. trade deal was announced on May 8th. According to a White House fact sheet, the deal, which was revealed on the 80th anniversary of Victory Day in Europe, is touted to create about $5 billion in new export opportunities for U.S. agriculture. It is also intended to lower tariffs and remove trade barriers for new export opportunities for American agriculture. Secretary Rawlins took a visit to the United Kingdom this past week following the announcement of that new trade deal. She praised the deal for expanding access for U.S. beef and ethanol in particular, calling it a major win for farmers and ranchers. The deal is expected to include more than $700 million in ethanol exports and about $250 million for other agriculture products, specifically beef. Rawlins says this new agreement ensures fair treatment and stronger economic ties after years of setbacks under the previous administration. Following the UK, Secretary Rawlins has a busy travel schedule as she's got trade missions planned to Japan, Vietnam, Brazil, Peru, Italy, and India. Those are on her immediate docket, targeting markets with high potential or trade imbalances. Other stops that may be made this year include Mexico, Taiwan, and the Dominican Republic. So maybe just one of many trade deals that we'll get to announce later this year.
Yeah, she definitely has a busy travel schedule. The USDA is offering up $100 million in funding to combat the highly pathogenic avian influenza. The competitive grants are open to vaccine makers, universities, states, and livestock groups. Priority will go to projects that are focused on new treatments, better diagnostics, vaccine development, and research to improve biosecurity and understand how that virus spreads. The announcement comes as the latest wave of avian flu begins to ease, which is good news. Cases are slowing down as bird migration tapers off for the season. Farm Bureau economist Bernd Nelson says the typical time of year, this is where birds have less movement and it is their nesting season. However, one of the major recent outbreaks had over 700,000 egg-laying hens that were affected in South Dakota. Nelson says the ultimate goal of any vaccination against bird flu is to protect our supply chain. Nelson detailed that more than 30 countries have now implemented some sort of vaccine strategy since 2005. Historically, when countries have done this has caused some major trade issues. Importing countries have a concern. They don't want to risk any imported birds spreading the virus to local flocks or to their wildlife. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that, but it is good news, Delaney, that we are starting to see this year's outbreak begin to ease.
We certainly are, and we might see some budget easing here as House Ag committees have a proposed budget moving forward. House Republicans are proposing $290 billion in cuts to food assistance programs like SNAP over the next 10 years. And they're planning to use some of those proposed savings to boost farm programs like crop insurance and commodity payments. The $230 billion bill was released on Monday and would start requiring individual states to pay for part of the SNAP programming starting in 2028. The plan is based on how accurately states manage SNAP payments. States with the fewest errors would pay just 5% of total costs, while those states with high error rates could pay up to 25% of costs. The states that would likely be hit the hardest include Alaska, South Carolina, Hawaii, Delaware, and New Jersey. Of course, though, the plan faces strong pushback. Some leaders are warning that shifting costs could force them to reduce benefits overall. And some Senate Republicans also worry the change would unfairly burden poorer states. The savings from the pullback in the budget with those nutrition programs, however, as we mentioned, would be used for more farmer direct programs, such as raising subsidy limits and increasing reference prices for PLC by 10 to 20%. The bill would also increase ARC guarantees to 90% and allow producers to enroll as many as 30 million base acres. Conservation and trade program promotions would also get funding increases, while climate restrictions on certain funds would potentially be removed.
Yeah, there's a good update there. So is it tomato or tomato?
I'm going to go with tomato.
It's tomato, yeah. The tomato suspension agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, the Florida Tomato Exchange, is now applauding the U.S. Department of Commerce's decision to terminate the 2019 tomato suspension agreement with Mexico that has been in place since 1996. The deal had shielded Mexican tomato exporters from anti-dumping duties if they met pricing rules, but critics argue it failed to prevent unfair trade. Exchange executive Robert Gunther called the move a long overdue victory for American farmers, citing that decades of undercutting by Mexican exporters. The decision follows a 2023 industry petition supported by lawmakers and farm groups. The Mexican tomato imports have risen nearly 400% since the first agreement back in 1996, now controlling over 70% of the U.S. market, while U.S. growers' share has dropped to only 30%. The agreement ends in July of 2025 after a 90-day transition period, at which point these anti-dumping duties will apply. Gunther says consumer prices are unlikely to be affected.
I'm not sure I believe that last part of the story, so maybe now is a good time to stock up or can some tomatoes if you're into that. The biofuel industry this week received major news upon a new federal reconciliation bill that includes a tax extension for 45Z. Part of a tax reform package unveiled by the House Ways and Means Committee introduced on Monday and now referred to by some as the One Big Beautiful Bill. It introduces changes and an extension to the Clean Fuel Production Credit, 45Z. The language in the bill will extend the 45Z tax credit by more than 4 years through 2031 and proposes a few areas to tighten eligibility. Those would include banning certain foreign feedstocks like used cooking oil from China and limiting qualifying materials to those produced in just the United States, Canada, or Mexico. It would also stop federal agencies from factoring in emissions from indirect land use change. And in a plot twist, the bill also makes fuels derived from animal manure now officially eligible for the credit. So still some uncertainty, but sounds like a step in the right direction here for some clarity.
Yeah, talking about uncertainty, this next headline will certainly carry some of that. Yeah, the USDA has taken an emergency action to protect the American livestock producer further from the New World Screwworm. Put into effect on May 11th, all imports of live cattle, horses, bison, and others through the southern border will have been suspended due to this fast-moving spread of the screwworm in Mexico. The parasitic fly, which poses a serious threat to livestock, the nation's food supply, has been detected as far north as Veracruz and Oaxaca. Did I do that right?
I think so.
Mexican City, which are states in Mexico about 700 miles south of the U.S. border. This import suspension will continue on a month-by-month basis until a significant window of containment is achieved. The USDA will continue constant collaboration with Mexico, including a review of the latest data and metrics within 2 weeks. Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins says the decision, though economically difficult, is necessary to stop the pest from reaching American herds. Rollins also said the protection of our animals and the safety of our nation's food supply is a national security issue of the utmost importance. Once we see increased surveillance and eradication efforts in place and positive results of those actions, we will remain committed to opening the border for livestock trade again. So more to come there.
Well, Tanner, this interview we're going to share from today was from a conversation I had while I was in D.C. last week. So I just want to preface it by saying we obviously had not received the 45Z potential extension at that point. But I caught up with Geoff Cooper, President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, to talk about the future of E15 and 45Z from his viewpoint. So let's dig into that conversation. Well, Geoff, I don't really think you need to give us a background or much of an introduction. We've had you on the podcast before. You're very common when people think about renewable fuels. I think of, and I think a lot of folks think of, Geoff Cooper. So thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Geoff, there are a myriad of issues that are impacting especially your line of work and farmers' mindset, what's moving forward here for this next few years of the administration. Lots of places to dig into. Let's start maybe with one of the most pressing, which I think is year-round E15.
Yep.
We got a summer waiver, we got an extension here, but it felt like we were so close to the finish line previously. Right. What's the path forward here, you think, for getting that passed permanently?
Yeah, so we really have had a good news, bad news story with E15 here in the last several weeks. We did get an announcement from EPA that will allow E15 to be sold throughout the summer months again this year, an emergency waiver. We've seen EPA do that the last several years now. And that's helpful, but it's sort of a Band-Aid fix. It allows the marketplace to sort of continue limping along through the summer months. What we really need is a permanent legislative solution that takes care of this once and for all and gets us out of this business of needing emergency waivers and ad hoc regulatory actions every spring. So we were very close to getting that legislation across the finish line in December as part of the continuing resolution bill. But at the last minute, all of the non-budgetary items in that bill, all of the extras, all of the riders were stripped out. Congressional Republicans decided they wanted to advance what they call a skinny continuing resolution bill. So all of the extraneous pieces fell out of that legislation, including the E15 bill. Very frustrating for us. We've been working on that for years. So we're looking for new opportunities in this Congress to advance that legislation. We think budget reconciliation may be, there may be a crack in the door there that we can jam our foot into. There's some procedural things and some rules that we need to look very closely at with putting kind of a non-budgetary item into a budget reconciliation bill. But yeah, bottom line is we're continuing to look for opportunities, continuing to work on getting that legislation across the goal line.
So obviously President Trump has been very pro-agriculture. That is a large part of his constituency. Do you feel like now, heading back into this new administration, 100 days in, are we starting back at ground zero with the Trump administration, or are we picking back up where things left off in his first time around?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. We've throughout the campaign and then certainly in the first 100 days, we've heard strong support from the Trump administration for renewable fuels. And we saw on day one in those executive orders that President Trump published, biofuels were prominently mentioned as an American energy source that needs to be prioritized as part of the strategy to, onshore manufacturing and bring reduce our dependence on foreign energy. So this administration so far in the first 100 days has been very supportive of renewable fuels. And we've heard that across the cabinet, whether it's Secretary Rollins or Administrator Zeldin. We've heard and seen really good, strong signals of support from this administration, which is great. And it does feel like they sort of picked up where the first Trump administration left off. It has not been, we haven't had to start over. There's I think, a good understanding of just how important biofuels like ethanol are to the farm economy and to rural communities where those fuels are produced.
Have they given any indication, though, of when they're going to be ready to pick this back up, sit down at the table and talk long-term solution?
Yeah. So we have begun some of those conversations. Unfortunately, they had a lot of sort of messes that needed cleaned up that were left to them from the Biden administration on renewable fuels policy. The E15 issue was unresolved. We're waiting on renewable fuel standard volumes. That was left unresolved by the Biden EPA. The 45Z issue is another one that has bled over. So I think the goal right now is for them to kind of stomp out some of these fires that are burning. And then I think once that's been accomplished, there's an openness, there's a willingness, and I think a desire to sit down with us and talk about the longer term, talk about sustainable aviation fuels and how do we really get that moving, and talk about some of these other big market opportunities, whether it's maritime fuel, whether it's growing our export market. There's I think a genuine openness and interest in having those conversations with our industry.
I'm glad you mentioned 45Z. That's one of the ones I definitely wanted to hit on with you too. I think disheartening might be a good way to kind of phrase up what happened. We were close to the finish line again under the Biden administration. Trump got into office, and now it feels like we're back at the starting line.
Yep.
Is the sentiment that 45Z will come to fruition, or is it we're starting back from ground zero?
Yeah, we were really nervous that this was going to happen. And that's why we were really pushing the Biden administration to pick up the pace on getting the rules in place for 45Z. And it wasn't until January, a week before the Biden administration left town, that we finally got something out of the Biden administration on 45Z. But it was what they called a notice of intent to propose regulations. So not very final, not a lot of finality to that. It's serving as sort of loose draft guidance. But you're right, the Trump administration has come in. They're doing a kind of a wholesale review of the 45Z program, along with all the other Inflation Reduction Act programs. And in our discussions with the U.S. Treasury and IRS, it isn't clear when they're going to move ahead on 45Z implementation, or if they're going to move ahead. And I think the other thing that they're watching, along with all of us, is what is Congress, what action might Congress take on 45Z and other Inflation Reduction Act credits. Congress is gearing up for budget reconciliation currently, and we know that some Republicans in Congress have drawn a target on those Inflation Reduction Act credits as a way of reducing spending and clawing back those programs to help pay for tax cuts and other priorities for this administration. So I think we'll know more in the next few weeks about where this is all headed, but certainly some headwinds for 45Z, and I think it's going to be a while before we know, what the direction of that tax credit program is, and that uncertainty isn't good for anybody. It's certainly not good for the ethanol industry, and it's certainly not good for the farmers that are supplying our industry with feedstock. So something we're paying very close attention to and hope to get some resolution on in the weeks ahead.
Do you think President Trump and his administration understand the importance of 45Z to, in particular, corn farmers?
Yeah, I think there is an understanding of the importance of new markets and expanding markets for farmers and for renewable fuel producers, and we've been explaining to them that 45Z is a way to do that. Sustainable aviation fuel, in my view, is going to struggle to take off unless there is supportive tax policy in place to help build that industry, and 45Z would help do that. But I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of investment that is standing on the sidelines, waiting for the rules of the game on 45Z, and we're just not going to see that investment. We're not going to see those plans move ahead until there's some clarity on where this is all going.
Yeah, so talking SAF or SAF, there's just the one facility right now in Georgia, right, that is currently in the U.S. ready to go for SAF.
So there's the one facility in Georgia that is using ethanol as a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel. There are a handful of other facilities that are using vegetable oil as a feedstock for SAF. So less than half a dozen, but there are some facilities that are producing SAF today. Again, the lion's share of it is coming from soybean oil, or used cooking oil, tallow, other fats, oils, and greases, and then just the one facility that's using ethanol. So, huge potential market opportunity, but without the right policy in place, it could be a missed opportunity.
And so I guess my follow-up to that is, do you see SAF still moving forward without clearance and guidance on 45Z? Meaning they're going to turn to other markets where they can supply that carbon-scored corn? Or do you see that industry being abandoned with a lack of clarity?
Well, I think there are some very stiff headwinds for sustainable aviation fuel without clear rules around 45Z in place. Now, there are certain states that have their own tax credits and other supportive policy. The state of Illinois, state of Minnesota, for example, Washington, and that's going to help. But I think we need a comprehensive national policy in place to really help support development of SAF. Otherwise, we're going to lose that opportunity to other countries, right? China is moving ahead with sustainable aviation fuel production. We're seeing quite a bit of activity in Europe because they have policy in place. We don't want to lose that race, right? We have the resources here to do sustainable aviation fuel really well. But again, it's going to take the right policy signals. And right now we don't have that.
When we think back to, the early 2000s when ethanol was really starting to take off, it was this new market creating new demand and opportunity for U.S. corn. We know that since 2006, the American farmer can produce more yield and more corn, and we need to find a market for that.
That's absolutely
Do you see SAF as being that next big market to chew through that extra supply that we're now producing?
Yeah, I think long term we do see a future for SAF, and we truly believe that at some point, if it isn't 45Z, it will be something else. I think policymakers will figure out the right mix of policy to really get this industry off the ground. But I think that's, maybe a long-term play. In the near term, the importance of E15 is really what we think, needs to be underscored. That's going to be what helps soak up some of the excess supply, and as yields continue to increase, that corn is going to need a home, and we think E15 is the switch that can be flipped the quickest to really soak up some of that excess supply and keep growing the marketplace.
How much maybe supply out of the market are we talking if we do see E15 passed year round?
Yeah, so today we're using about 14 billion gallons of ethanol domestically. It's almost all in the form of 10% ethanol blends. So if we go from 10% to 15, the theoretical potential is adding another 6 or 7 billion gallons of ethanol demand. That's enormous. I mean, that's, 2.5 billion bushels of new corn demand that we don't have today. That's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen fairly quickly, we think. Again, if we clear away some of these hurdles that have prevented E15 from being more rapidly adopted.
When we think about other hurdles then as well, Geoff, tariffs, what is the impact there short-term and long-term for ethanol leaving our borders?
Right. Well, that's another issue we're watching very, very closely, of course, because exports have become so important to our industry, a very important demand segment. Last year, we had a record volume of ethanol exports, about 2 billion gallons. So, roughly 12% of what we're producing is being exported today. We cannot afford to go backward on our exports. We need to keep growing that with that demand. So we are, anxious about the tariff story and the trade story today. The last thing we need to see is a country like Canada, our top export market, decide that they're going to retaliate and institute a tariff on U.S. ethanol. It's something they've threatened already. That would be a massive, massive hit to our industry. So we are doing what we can to work with the Trump administration to make sure they understand the impacts on our industry of some of the decisions they're making and some of the negotiations they're having on trade.
We've given a lot of love and attention to the corn side of the balance sheet. What about other renewable fuels? Are there any others that you're excited about that are going to support other grains and oilseeds?
Yeah, well, I think the renewable diesel story is another one that is really exciting. But again, they're looking for higher RFS volumes to really support growth in renewable diesel. That's a great story because it boosts demand for soybeans, obviously through the use of soybean oil, but also every ethanol plant in the country today is removing the oil from the corn that they're processing, and that oil is going into the renewable diesel sector as well. So very excited about the opportunity for renewable diesel moving forward. And that could be used as a precursor for SAF production as well. So, again, it all depends on having the right policies in place, whether it's the RFS, whether it's the right tax policy, whether it's year-round E15. And that's why it's so important that our industry and the farmers that we work with are making their voices heard with policymakers here in D.C., but also the regulatory agencies, USDA, EPA especially, and Department of Energy.
Great. Geoff, is there any other topics we didn't touch on you want to make mention of?
I think we covered the gamut.
All right. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks for having me, Delaney.
Well, that was a good talk there, Delaney. I can only imagine planting progress and some of this other news is affecting markets. So what do we see happen this week?
It's honestly kind of hard to believe all of the events we saw in this week, because coming off the weekend, we saw positive sentiment and comments coming out of the Geneva talks, where the U.S. and China sat down to discuss joint trade. A joint statement released by both countries shared a drastic reduction in tariffs from both countries for at least the next 90 days. The U.S. will drop the 145% tariff on Chinese imports to now just 30%, while Chinese duties on U.S. imports will fall to 10% from their current 125% levels. In addition to those reductions, China has also agreed to lift countermeasures issued April 2nd, including restrictions on rare earth minerals, and the U.S. has reduced tariffs on products under $800 imported from China down to 54% from the previous 120%. The joint statement also included remarks about setting up a mechanism for ongoing conversations and negotiations, and that certainly gave some positive sentiment to the larger markets. Then to officially kick off the week, we saw the May WSDA report drop, which gave us our first glimpse into the 2025-2026 crop year from USDA's viewpoint. There were a few surprises that were dropped in this report, including lower ending stocks for corn, soybeans, and wheat for the 2024-2025 marketing year here in the United States, and global ending stocks for the 25-26 marketing year also reflected some lower numbers. And then we also saw our first look at yields. Corn reflected a 181 and beans at a 52.5 bushel per acre, but that didn't do a lot to support old crop corn as they finished lower on the day Monday. Markets have since tried to recover this week, but are still sitting around 450 in old crop futures. Soybeans, however, had a different story to tell this week as they hit 9-month highs this week on that announcement of the proposed biofuel tax credit extension. Weather will still certainly be the story that's front and center as we head into the key growing season. And given what we saw this week with U.S. and global stocks, a weather story here is what markets and I think farmers are both going to certainly be watching for to see if we get some sort of summer weather story here, because as we saw, stocks are already tighter than what USDA had originally intended. So
yeah, I know it's still early, but I've been seeing quite a bit of Snapchats and Twitter feeds of replant happening in that Indiana, Ohio area. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of effect that has. We know planting progress numbers can't go backwards.
That's true.
But it'll be interesting to see what type of jump they take for us next week.
Or prevent plant acres or abandoned acres will certainly come into effect. And you really think about the I states, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois. If one of those 3 states has some sort of major issue, that might be enough for a little story here.
That's correct. But again, thank you, listeners, for hanging out with us. We appreciate that. We love sharing these headlines with you. If you come across something during the week that you want us to share with our listeners, send it over. We'd be happy to report on that. But for today, what do you say? Should we let them go?
Let's let them go.